Hi and welcome to this video where I will talk a little bit about the two readings for this week, the one by Rodrik and the one by Colontone and Stanig. We'll start there. Well, let's do a bit of an overview of what they're both doing. What's the connection between them? And what it is that we're looking at this week is specifically the propensity of economic shocks. The propensity of economic shocks to give rise to this backlash against globalization, to this backlash. So both papers are looking at that. They take somewhat different approaches and they cover, or they focus perhaps on different areas. Particularly in terms of focusing on different areas, the Colontone and Stanig one has focused mostly on Western Europe. And the Rodrik one is focused more on the United States. Okay. The other differences between them is that the Colontone and Stanig one, the one that's focusing on Europe, the main argument there is about the difficulty in separating economic factors from sort of cultural factors in this backlash, right? So one of the big questions when this first starts to become very apparent, this backlash back in 2016, one of the big questions, one of the big debates in the literature that you'll find in there, and we've already seen some of this, right, in previous readings, is what's the cause of this? Is this because people don't like migrants? Is this people are sort of going against immigration? They feel sort of threatened culturally and nationally, and so they're voting for sort of these radical right parties. Is this the reason, or is it economic factors? Right? Is it that that people are losing jobs, or that their wages are declining, or that they're not increasing quickly enough? Right. So Colontone and Stanig, one of the big things that they're trying to do in their reading is to say, look, actually, you can't really separate those two factors. So all those studies in the past that are finding that economic factors are not as big a deal and not as important, they're suffering from this problem of not really being able, or not properly separating, because it's impossible to do, right, economic factors from cultural factors, right? And so they say that that sort of research, it's in some ways invalid if they're attempting to do that, right? If they're attempting through statistical methods to try and separate economic factors from cultural ones, that's not possible. Okay. And what they do then is they look at economic nationalism. And so you can sort of already see what they're doing, right? Is that they're combining those two sides of things, right? Economics and nationalism into this idea of economic nationalism, and you'll find in there like what are the three. They talk about like the three key features of economic nationalism, what each of them means, what each of them is, and then what they do is they see that many of these radical right parties, they show that they are actually adopting this economic nationalist platform, and that they're becoming much more popular, right? They're getting much more of the vote. And then they start to ask themselves, well, why is this the case? And they look at several different factors, some of them economic and some of them cultural, right? So that's quite a good overview, I think, of the reading. So you can have a look at that and certainly look at what are the factors of economic nationalism, just how popular those parties that are adopting economic nationalism, just how popular have they become in Western Europe over the past 30 years, actually, and what's the role? How does each of those? Because although we can't separate completely economics and cultural factors, we can still explain how each of the factors, how immigration, how economic shocks, how they work together, right? So how not just that they are sort of inseparable, but how do they work together? And so you'll find that out in this reading too, at least according to Colontone and Stanig. So that's that one. The Rodrik reading, it's a little bit harder reading, to be honest with you. Now I like it because Rodrik goes into some I think goes into a lot of detail, and he's much more focused on economics. So he's much more focused on economic factors, and there's one or two things that I think I'll kind of explain a little bit in this video that I think will help you to understand the reading better, right? At least to give you some sort of a basis, on which to sort of approach this reading, right? Because it's, as I said, it's not an easy read. I think the first thing that you'll find that will make it maybe a little bit off-putting is the formal theory that Rodrik uses early on. Formal theory meaning sort of mathematical logic, right? So Rodrik wants to bring in some, well, he's talking a lot about economic theory, which might generally be off-putting if you're not a big economics fan. I always think that this sort of a class, right, we're in a global studies class where we're looking at this backlash against globalization, and I personally think that, when we're looking at that sort of thing, yes, political science is useful, and we are in the school of politics and global studies, but we're in the politics of school of politics and global studies, right? And I think global studies is a cross-disciplinary discipline, right? That draws definitely from political science and international relations and that sort of thing, which is probably where I'm most comfortable, right, and most qualified, likely, but also from places like anthropology, right, and sociology. And certainly economics, right, should be in that, right? Social sciences, perhaps more broadly. So, so economics is definitely, it's heavy on the economics. Rodrik actually is still a political scientist, right? So, but he's drawing heavily from economics. So this formal theory, right, you'll see that fairly early on in the reading, right? And if you don't let it put you off. First of all, it's only in one section of the reading. If that does put you off, and secondly, it's not really essential to sort of follow. I mean, it's great if you can. The idea of using formal mathematical theory in these papers is, I mean, part of it I think is about giving a convincing argument, right? And most people find like mathematical logic to be persuasive, right, and to be sort of foundational and fundamental. And so the fact that Rodrik would use a formal theory, right, mathematical theory, and he comes up, you'll see how he comes up with these the equations that he comes up with. But unless you give it quite a lot of thought and sit down, go over and over and over it, I'm saying that's not necessary, but if you want to do that, then you'll probably be even more convinced by his argument. So, again, if you accept, right, that mathematical logic is sort of fundamental and foundational, and that it can be applied to social situations, right, which is not a given, right, but certainly for Rodrik, that's what he's doing. So, okay. So check that out. But putting that aside and giving you some sort of a baseline, ultimately what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, and ultimately what he concludes, right, is that, look, this rise in populism, it's not unexpected, and it's sort of a warning sign, right, and we should do something about it, right? So the thing that we should do about it, right, is I'll explain next, I think. It's heavily based on economic theory. In particular, it's heavily based on the idea of international trade. In economic theory, in international trade, there's sort of two factors, two very fundamental factors that come across. One is international trade gives a net gain. Right, so the countries that engage in international trade become wealthier as a result. Right, there's more income for both countries. And when I say both countries, think of both countries as two economies, right? And think of these economies as producers of, and let's keep it simple, right? Of course, it's much more complicated than this, but let's think of them as producers of goods, of a couple of goods, even two goods. And as they come into a trade relationship, they realize that one of the countries is better positioned to produce one of the two goods, and the other country the other, right? And so the idea is that the comparative advantage, but but also that in specializing in the good that country A, let's call them country A and country B. So country A has two goods. Let it be wine and onions or something like that. Wine and onions. It might be France. All right. Country B, let's say there's also wine and onions. Let's say country A has wine, comparative advantage in wine, and country B has comparative advantage in onions. Okay. So now, if they come to trade together, right, when they come to trade, what will happen is they'll both have a net increase in their income. And that's why international trade is beneficial. But what will happen is that the distribution of that income between producers of wine and producers of onions will differ, right? It'll be redistributed. It'll be distributed differently, okay? All right. And Rodrik's going to build on that. Right? So that's something to have done. And you understand why it'll be distributed differently, right? Because of course, in one country, that's in country A, that's not going to specialize in producing wine, because we're now importing the onions from country B. The onion producers in country A are going to have less of the income than they used to have. Right? The total share of the pie is going to increase. Sorry, the total pie is going to increase, but the onions producers' share of that pie is going to reduce to, well, probably nothing if we're going to import all of our onions, right? So now while the country as a whole, though, if you count the wine and the onion producers, is going to benefit from the trade, the onion producers are not going to benefit. They're going to be very, very adversely impacted. Okay, so those two things. Distribution is within the economy, and which producers get more of the pie. But the net gains, right, is the overall pie, right? And so what Rodrik's focused on is this. When he goes back quite far. First of all, it goes back to the 19th century, and that's interesting. He starts off at the beginning of the history of globalization. He says, right at the end of the 19th century, this is how globalization worked, right? And this is where we were at the end of the 19th century. But he says there was a backlash against that level of globalization. And then after the Second World War, there was another attempt, right, at globalization. Okay, but this second attempt, and globalization, I'm saying globalization, I think he's more saying like integration, economic integration, openness of international trade. All right. So he says, okay, after the Second World War, we're having another go at it, despite the fact that there was a backlash after the first time. Okay, so we're having another go at it. And here's the basis of that go at it. What we were doing was we were saying, okay, listen, we understand that international trade, freer trade, is going to result in a bigger pie for everybody, for the whole economy. It's going to increase economic growth. But we also know from economics, and we also recognize, say the politicians, that that the distribution of that income throughout the economy is going to be severely altered. Some producers, right, let's say in Britain, producers of coal are going to be adversely affected because we're going to import a lot of coal. Other producers, producers of banking services, financial services, banks, they're going to benefit a lot because Britain exports a lot of banking services. So what we have to do then is what we're going to do, what we promise to do is, you let us have the international trade, the international free trade that's going to make it's going to give us a bigger pie. It's going to give us a bigger economy. It's going to lead to economic growth. Great. And that extra money that we get, we can use that to compensate the people who are producing coal or something else that's going to be adversely affected. All right. And that's the deal, right? So you guys who are mining coal, you let us have this international trade deal, and we'll make sure that we redistribute towards you, so that you get so that the industry is going to die, but we're going to save you with the extra money that we get, and we'll all be better off. Our standard of living will grow. That was the deal. So Rodrik says, well, how's that worked out, right? And part of the answer, right, is that redistribution has become less and less effective. The other thing is this, and he talks about this as well in the paper. He says, look, the other thing is this, is the more you liberalize trade, the more of the barriers you remove, the less each subsequent removal of barriers really impacts the economy. So if you already have quite low barriers to trade and you lower them a little bit more, the benefit that you have from having low trade barriers, you've already had that benefit. You're not going to get much more by lowering the barriers anymore. You already have it. But conversely, and this is I think key here, conversely, the lowering of the barriers, let me tell you this. Okay, so Rodrik's claiming this, and he's claiming this based on like efficiency, cost, and taxes. Right? Look for this part in the reading and read this a couple of times, if it takes you a couple of times. But so he's looking at tax rate, and he says, look, the efficiency cost of a tax is actually the tax rate squared or something like that, right? But he said the redistributive effects are linear. Okay, so what that means is this. Each subsequent, we've already said this part, but each subsequent lowering of the barrier, once you've already got low trade barriers, doesn't increase the efficiency as much, doesn't increase the efficiency very much. It doesn't increase, you don't get much more net gains. And as an example of this, he uses NAFTA. Right, so have a look and see what he thinks about NAFTA and the benefit to the US economy from NAFTA. Okay, so look at that. But he said the redistributive effects are they're not related in the same way. In fact, the redistributive effects are more linear to price change. So what you get is basically the upshot of it is when you get a small, when your barriers are low already, right? Which by the 1990s and the barriers are very low now. Right? Maybe from the 40s and 50s there were still barriers to reduce. But by the time in the 1990s, there's no more barriers to reduce. I mean, they're already pretty low. So now you're getting, small pushes and not much gain from it because they're already very low. On the other hand, every time you push the barriers down, the distribution effects within the economy, right, from they're still just as big. They don't get any smaller as you get lower and lower and lower barriers. The effects of distribution stay the same, but the effects of like the net growth and the efficiency get smaller and smaller and smaller. So you see now we're at a point, says Rodrik, where we're at the point where lowering trade barriers now is affecting distribution a lot, but it's not growing the pie very much. That's it. And I think if you've got that, you've got a very good foundation for reading Rodrik. Then so do that on that basis, and don't get put off by the formal theory. Even if you skip that section, you'll still get a lot out. I mean, you'll still get almost everything that I just told you. Because to be honest, I read very quickly through that part. Because anyway, I'm not a huge formal theory kind of person, but what I'm, again, coming back to the very beginning, what I'm looking at you getting at here is what's the effect of economic shocks? To what extent is economic shocks are these? Just to explain, because otherwise it's not really connected to what I've been saying. But economic shocks are China coming into the World Trade Organization, are NAFTA, right? So it's more the effects of a huge shift in the international trade regime, international trade regime with China or with NAFTA. So those are the ones. But he also talks a little bit about Europe. In fact, he references the Colontone and Stanig reading that we're also doing this week as sort of a good example of the same thing that he's talking about in the United States happening in Europe. So that's that. I'm quite pleased with that introduction, and I think that gives you a good basis. And let me give you a promise, right? If you read Rodrik, if you read Colontone and Stanig, there's not many people in the world left. In fact, there's maybe nobody in the world left that will really be more informed and more able to discuss the economic factors of this backlash against globalization than you will be. And that's really, that's the sort of, that's what gives me the excitement, I guess, is sort of pointing these things out to you guys and pointing these readings out and sort of helping you concentrate on them and giving you a sort of a platform from which to read them. So again, I hope that's helped you. If you do have any questions, if you do the readings and you have any questions about the readings, I'll do my best. I'm not Rodrik, right? I'm not Colontone and Stanig in all sorts of very real ways, but I did enjoy the reading, and I will have a go at trying to answer any questions that you would have about it. So yeah, there you go. I'm going to end this now and have a good rest of your week.